welcome to Varn Blog and Regrettable Century with a guest from In the Measures Taken. And this is one of the first on a series of panels on the legacy and decline of Trotskyism in the United States and also the world. There will be supplementary panels on this, but I'm also going to tell people that I'm not just picking on Trotskyism. We're also going to talk about the decline of non-Dengist, non-connected to official Chinese communism, Maoism, in a separate series. This is partly inspired by trying to figure out why there are so many Marxist-Leninists who are not in Marxist-Leninist organizations, who have no ties to Trotskyism or Maoism, who have even less of a mass base, which we're going to talk about because none of these organizations ever really had a mass base. Not at least after World War II, really. And then I think I'm going to also start off with the strange non-death of Trotskyism, because one of the questions I've always had is, why did it survive for another generation after 1992, at least? Because almost every question that made Trotskyism unique is gone, and the Trotskyist organizations no longer had a cohesion and coherent conception of either what their two actual theoretical innovations, permanent revolution or transitional program. Because for a lot of Trotskyist organizations like the ISO, they had what I would consider Gizdaism almost, where they like, we know that our reforms are going to fail, but we're going to push for them anyway to radicalize the population. And I'm like, literally, that's the first thing Marx himself warned against of the political strategy. Yeah. Of the political strategies, that's the one that got Marx to say, I am not a Marxist, clearly and unequivocally. There's no ambiguity about it. And yet that was maintained by, like, I don't know, half the ISO. Also,
yeah, but they never admitted that they thought that those reforms were never going to happen or weren't going to work. They were able to provide that level of cognitive dissonance.
Right. So first off, I guess to talk about the decline of Trotskyism in America, we have to do what is a dastardly situation, and briefly as we can, talk about what the Trotskyist factions and sects were and where they came from. Because one of the interesting things that I will point out as we talk about this, there was maintenance and revival of Trotskyism in America in the aughts and teens till about the mid-aught teens. But interestingly, none of it was from the American traditions. The Canaanite ones, the original Trotskyist sects and ideas, were dying, and increasingly the ISO, which does one of the few organizations we're going to talk about still existing, unlike SALT, which was literally salted from another country. It increasingly dropped its Shackmanite Draperite character for a Cliffite character.
SALT, you mean?
No.
The ISO.
The ISO. By the time I encountered the ISO, I thought it was like purely a Tony Cliff organization because it had such strong ties to the SWP, even though it had been kicked out of the IST.
Yeah, I mean, it affiliated with the IST after already having been an independent grouping, and then got kicked out. But then maintained the exact same politics and still like bought all and reprinted all of the IST's books. And yeah, it was just a Cliffite organization by the time I joined in like 2004.
Yeah.
We're going to have to talk about the tradition of splitting, actually. I mean, the tendency of splitting.
Yeah.
But did you really want to start at the very beginning, Varn?
Maybe we should start at the end. Also, we should tell. I don't know. This one's tough because the decline of Trotskyism in America has happened multiple times. And that in of itself is hard to explain why it kept coming back.
Okay, yeah.
This one feels terminal in a different way. And also, I think we have to like look at the opinion of Trotskyism in America, because like I remember during like Trotsky's birthday, you had the Northites like complaining about like social democrats celebrating ice picks in the DSA, not just Stalinists anymore. So
When was that? Was that recently?
No, it's about 3 years ago.
Okay, yeah.
It was like right before the pandemic.
That was when the Stalinists and the DSA hated Trotskyists, and then all the boring Harringtonites and the DSA hated Trotskyists because all of the SALT and ISO people that joined that were trying to take over the DSA.
So we have to talk. I guess we do have to talk about the. Maybe we work backwards. This one's a tough one. But I'm also gonna give us all of our biases. Stephan, have you now or ever been a follower of any Trotskyite?
Yeah, so I think of this in terms of genealogies. So I think that I did inherit a version of Trotskyism that's unambiguous. I was a member of the IMHO, the International Marxist Humanist Organization, which was sort of like my graduate training in Marxism. And that was a Raya Geneevskaya organization. Raya herself was secretary to Trotsky and a prominent American member of the SWP before the Johnson-Forson tendency split. And therefore, I inherited some version, therefore, of Trotskyism, which is a version of Leninism. It's a curious one, having gone through many twists and turns, including giving up any concept of the party, and etc.
No Vanguard Party, no. What else? No programism at all.
No proletariat.
Well, right, that's right. No proletariat necessarily, right? Instead,
only the advanced parts of the proletariat. By advanced, we mean of color.
Yeah,
it's true. Also, the curious habit of miners and agricultural workers to happen to, when in the right conditions, meaning properly trained, properly allowed for by the party or by the organization, will just sprout. Just lines from the phenomenology of spirit. It's a remarkable phenomenon.
And interestingly, these organizations, while they are not parties and denounce them, often have at least one of them has a more authoritarian structure than a lot of Marxist-Leninist parties does.
Yeah, they're all over the map. I think you're talking about Kleiman's organization, which is a model of first person boosterism. But that said, like Trotskyism at its very origin, many of these organizations are built around individuals, and those individuals often have tremendous contributions to make. I mean, these days they're not like political figures; they're academic figures. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything these people have to say is wrong. In fact, I still learn a lot. I admire the Hudis Anderson Go-To program translation that we just got. That's really useful, etc.
Regrettable Jason. Have you now, or have you ever been a Trotskyite?
Yeah. The short answer is yes. I mean, I think I was a member of the Young Communist League in the Communist Party until I was about 19, and then I joined the ISO then I was doing the ISO for kind of like a while until I was about 30, and I was in the National Committee and whatever. It really just kind of defined my life for a little while. So then afterward, I was like looking around for whatever else is Trotskyist that I could do while being a member of the DSA. It took a little while for me to like really fully like consciously abandon all of the like the heritage and so on. But even now, like, it's like it's very interesting and important to like know stuff, and so I read some things. But I would say that I think I'm finally really fully abandoned all of my Trotskyism.
All right.
Finally, he's done.
Yeah, it took like almost dying, but then
Exercised.
Yeah.
All right. Regrettable Chris, have you now or ever been a Trotskyite?
Yeah, well, my trajectory is similar to Jason's. In fact, I'm the one that got him to join the Young
That's
Communist
true.
League and the CPUSA. Then, right around the time that we quit the CPUSA, I was really looking around for different Trotskyist organizations, and I was like super into the Socialist Alternative at the time. I think it was Socialist Alternative. I don't know. I was like in my early 20s, maybe. It was Socialist Alternative. I was looking into them, and I really liked them, and I was in contact with some people from there. And then that was around the time that we met the ISO people, and we were like, these guys are kind of weird with their state capitalism shit, and they're like, no, there wasn't actually real socialism in the Soviet Union, kind of like intellectually dishonest obfuscation way to like not actually have to deal with the question.
Definitely.
But whatever, they're the biggest game in town, and they're really the only ones here. So Jason and I joined, and we were both pretty much crypto orthotrots the entire time we were in the ISO. And then I quit in, I think, 2014, whenever they did their big shift towards, forget everything we ever said about identity politics. Now we're like actually really into identity politics. And it wasn't so much the identity politics, but just the really dishonest and shitty way that they went about doing it that made me quit. I just lost interest in spending all of my time doing Trotskyist stuff. And then I kind of just floated around until Jason and I joined the DSA as a paper member and never did anything. But yeah, I would say that I've pretty much exercised the Trotskyism from my brain for the most part. But, that the post-Trotskyism is still rattling around in there with what's left of my Leninism and everything else.
Yeah, I stuck around for like another year to like whatever, keep fighting the good fight. But that's like the worst aspect of being a Trotskyist is just not giving up and just being entirely alone and thinking that was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Me, have I ever been a Trotskyite? And the question to that is actually similarly to Stephan, complicated, but it's more complicated by the fact that I have come through arguably 3 different post-Trotskyist tendencies.
Are you collecting them?
For a while before 2014, yeah. So I was involved in the SP USA as a fellow traveler because I was out of the country because I couldn't join a local. And I was attached to I believe it's called the militant tendency. And it was basic. I didn't know this. I didn't have a word for this. It was basically a post-Marciite tendency of like, what would be anything after 1978 doesn't count Maoist, and Trotskyists who were willing to work with them because they had a critique of the Soviet Union, but they were defensist. So that was the tendency I was allied to. I would love to pretend it was that coherent, or they stated that clearly. They did not. We read a bunch of Trotsky and Mao text, etc. Coming out of that, I was thrown first towards the Kasama project, which was immediately unpalatable to me, and then towards towards Platypus Affiliated Society, of which I was a member for a year and a fellow traveler for a year and a half. The Platypus Affiliated Society's lineage is complicated, but at least a few of its initial members are direct descendants of the Spartacist League and that branch of Orthodox Trotskyism. But while there is an admiration for Orthodox Trotskyism within Platypus, no one would ever accuse it of being Trotskyist. And then lastly, when I was coming out of that, I was reading a lot of the Weekly Worker, the McNair it's not McNair and Jack Conrad and whatnot publication from the Communist Party of Great Britain Provisional Committee, and got sucked into North Star, which was post ISO, which was a publication, wasn't really an organization.
We really hated North Star.
Yeah. No, he really did. Like,
Yeah.
like
Sorry
I got
about
put
that.
I've been put on an ISO enemies list multiple times. but
It's actually amazing how often our paths almost crossed, and
Yeah.
what we probably would have had to fight if they did.
We met actually just late enough that we didn't have to declare each
Yeah.
other enemies.
Yeah.
Luckily.
So, and that was a Kameho inspired, which is also kind of a Marxist tendency. Now, for those of you who don't know, Marxism is what we might call tanky Trotskyism, and that's always been true. It defended the Soviet Union's actions in Hungary and in the Prague Spring, it being Sam Marcy, which is why he split. However, a lot of the current U.S. Marxist organizations will try to tell you that he wasn't really a Trot at that point, and that's not true. He remained a Trot, as far as I know, his entire life. So that leads us to the context of world Trotskyism. One of the things we have to deal with in the U.S. is the U.S. has an indigenous, for lack of a better word, Trotskyist tradition that goes directly back to the man himself. Yep. And there is an imported Trotskyist tradition which goes back to Britain for the most part. The Argentine, Mexican, and French Trotskyists have had some influence on American Trotskyism, like theoretically, but their organizations have never. So, as far as I know, I can't find any like imported organizations from France or Argentina. And like Mandelitism was kind of like, you know, it was kind of adopted by the US SWP, but
do we have any Posadists groups here?
No. Posadist tendencies are post groups, so like they count. I mean, it's weird. It kind of, I literally think that started from an internet meme. So that's confusing. And if you're one of my many viewers who were politicized after 2014, or have never had an experience with Trotskyism, or come from, say, a more like a PSL or WWP, that's World Workers' Party, a Party for Socialism and Liberation, view of revisionism. Also, by the way, I hate to tell you guys, but you guys used to be Trots, my PSL and WWP friends. But
definitely.
You probably don't know any of this, and this is probably alienating factions. And then, you know, we're not even dealing with all the post-Trotskyist stuff, because that's a whole, that might have to be its own legacy. Like, why was there even a thing called post-Trotskyism?
And really, like, the ISO should be considered post-Trotskyist. Like I know any like ortho-Trots in the audience are going to be like, the ISO isn't real Trotskyist. I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll concede that. Like, the ISO is definitely rejected enough of Trotsky to probably be considered post-Trotskyist.
The ISO in the UK SWP is weird also, because they were both Stalinophobic and Stalinophilic at the same time. That's a categorization I get from Richard Rubin and Chris Cutrone from the Platypus Affiliated Society. They tend to spectrumize Trotskyism and Stalinophobic and Stalinophilic variants depending on their stances towards defensism. It's not actually helpful with the ISO, because the ISO unfolded a shit ton of Althusser, so much so that a lot of people don't realize that Althusser was a Marxist-Leninist trying to like do it in a very strange, trying to basically justify a form of Maoism in a very arcane way.
While remaining an official communist, right? He just remained an official communist his entire life. You know, can I just butt in to distinguish two things? So one of them, and I love the idea that there's a kind of Trot-Kinsey scale, but that whatever that is, it's got to be describing what the positions of a certain organization or certain members of that organization are on the ground in the present. And then there's another thing that we were talking about earlier, which is acknowledging that these things have lineages. And in fact, maybe in the Trotskyist tradition, those lineages are more important than in other realms of Marxism. And so it matters like where you came from, where the organization came from. Those two things can have almost nothing to do with one another in a determining capacity. So it just isn't the case that if you inherited your Trotskyism from some genealogy, one is able to predict what the position of any one of your members is at any given time.
That's true. I would say the only thing that you can predict from it is probably organizational structure, and that would be like adherence to the sect form and the way that it's organized in a sort of caricature of early Bolshevism.
That's a good point.
So I'm going to put it to you this way. I'm going to list the various tendencies that were listed not by their founder names, which is how Trotskyists refer them, but by a person affiliated with Neo-Trotskyism, I think. And this is Amal Sanhan. She did a map of U.S. Trotskyism that is incredibly helpful, but
Jason did that map back in like 2010.
Arguably, this map actually argues that you have to acknowledge that all lineages within a DSA that aren't like pro ML as post Trotskyist, which is kind of funny and I think actually true.
Yeah.
Because I think Harrington is conciliationist Shackmanism. But these are the tendencies that she came up with that distinguish them. Official communism, which doesn't last very long. By like the end of the Comintern, there's no Trotskyist group maintaining a left opposition position to official communism. Orthodox Trotskyism, and by that we can claim a couple of different tendencies. The Spartacist and the IBT is one, the International Bolshevik tendency, and then the Grantites are really what we should call them in the IMT form, the Woodites, the International Marxist tendency, where they really care if you accept the Big Bang or not. Ultra-leftism, which is Trotskyists who subsumed into either councilist or Berdigist organizations or took councilist or Berdigist positions. Although, interestingly, I would call them left communists, not ultra-leftists. But interestingly, Trotskyist left communists tend to not be accepted by other left communists because if you've met people who are more fractious than even Trotskyists, it's left communist. Right oppositionists are people who emerge who decided to align to Bukharin, which interestingly I might count as, which is funny. I joke that I'm like that I'm on the right of the ultra left. Anti-defensism, that was you guys. Shackmanism, Cliffeitism.
It never really was us though. Like me and Jason, but the rest of the ISO, yeah.
Officially, yeah.
Yeah,
officially, you guys were anti-defensists.
To our great shame.
Anarchism, which tends to come out of Draperism, like Wayne Price, who was in one of the videos that I suggested we watch, which I'm going to link in the show notes for this. Opportunism is a tendency, which some of these I'm like, hey, but some of these existed within the same organization because I think the ISO and the US and the UK SWP were opportunists as fuck.
Yeah,
absolutely. Democrat tailist organization.
Pro-Marxist Leninist Trotskyism, aka American Marxism. Feminist organizations that were Trotskyist in origin. CWI and its offshoots, which is considered an I have never understand if we can consider the militant tendency orthodox or not. Because when I encountered SALT, they seemed like the ISO, but and I would always confuse them with Salton, Australia, which is
exactly like the ISO.
which is a Cliffite organization.
Yeah, they used to come to our conferences and stuff.
Yeah. Luxembourgist. Multiple programs of unclear groups. Castroism, which is the main Canaanite branch of the USSWP, really splits from Orthodox Trotskyism when they don't go full pro Marxist-Leninist or pro Marciite, but we're going to defend Castroism.
Yeah, but they also they heralded that by formally denouncing the fact that they were Trotskyists. They wrote what was it called? It was a pamphlet called "Their Trotsky and Ours."
Yeah.
So they I don't know. They kind of don't belong.
Well, the thing is that most of these groups don't belong by the time you get to the 2010s. Let's be honest.
Yeah, definitely.
I love that there's multiple programs that are unclear, and the Marxist humanisms, of which there are at least two, and that is confusing because Marxist humanism also refers to Gramsciism, to Khrushchevism, etc., which is always like Schrodinger's Marxist humanist. When I meet someone who's a Marxist humanist, I'm like, are you a Hudis and Anderson Marxist humanist? Are you a Kleiman Marxist humanist? Are you just like not an Althusserian Marxist humanist? Which one are you?
It's the hyphen. Yeah, go look for the hyphen. If it's a hyphen, then it's us. If there's no hyphen, then it's them.
Yes, I'll say so. Like many fucking things, a small technicality of grammar is the only way you can tell the difference. So it took us 20 minutes just to lay down the trajectories. That isn't even getting to the different sects and sect tendencies. So there are at least 50-something sects that have existed that claim Trotskyist legacy in the United States. There are at least 8 or 9 named tendencies, not just we talked about in direction, but there's the militant tendency, there's a Grantite tendency, there's the Marciite tendency, there's a Norphite tendency. The Norphite's real weird. There's the Oriolite tendency, which I don't think exists anymore. There's a Shackmanite tendency. There's a Cliffite tendency, which subsumed the Shackmanite tendency. There's the Draperite subset of the Shackmanite tendency. There's the right-wing subset of the Shackmanite tendency.
Doesn't the Draperite sub tendency go into the ISO as well?
Some of it does. Some of it becomes anarchist.
And some of it becomes a section of the group that was called Solidarity. The group that is called Solidarity.
Yes. And then some of it becomes the foundation of what is now Marxist-Leninist brag monthly review. So
yeah, right.
There's the Spartacist and post-Spartacist league, and then there are like Workers' Power, Alarm, etc. Now that's just in the United States. In the world, there's Pabloite, Mandelite. I forget the French tendencies beyond Mandel, but there's a bunch of them.
It's such
there's just a lot. Yeah.
Anyway.
There's Posadite, and every now and then these ideological tendencies will show up in America as like subsect of groups because someone read a book from somewhere or found an internet meme or something. Yeah. So, now I know that sounds crazy because you're like, oh, only Trotskyists do that. If I start listening to different Maoist traditions where legacy is less important, but splitting is also super common, you will have a similarly weird concatenation of.
It's actually probably double even.
Yeah.
Well, that should be curious because it is the intention of Trotskyism from the very beginning, from 1929, to found an alternative set of organizations in every country possible in order to wrest dominance of the international communist movement from the Soviet state. those who currently control the Soviet state. At least that's the idea right up until the Second World War. That's just not true of any. There's never a moment in the Chinese Revolution when some figure in the Chinese Revolution decides that there really ought to be an alternative international set of organizations.
That's true.
So maybe it's the case that Maoism in the United States is the way it is in its sect-like existence because they're just organizationally tailing the Trotskyists.
I think it's bigger than that.
I would say it's actually got to be bigger than that because that tendency amongst Maoists happens in countries that don't have strong Trotskyist movements.
Yeah.
Some of that has to do with the internal politics of China and people attaching themselves to particular figures outside of China, like Lin Bao or Zhou Enlai or any or the Gang of Four or later Deng or anti-Deng movements. And then there's also the fact that in Latin America, there's auxiliary movements that emerge, such as the most famous would be Shining Path Alonzoism, but there's a bunch of others. So there's that. There's actually a whole book on this that actually does a comparison between Trotskyism and Maoism as alternative forms of Marxist-Leninism. It's by A. Belden. It's from 1988. And it's called Trotskyism, Maoism in the U.S. and France. But it talks about how in certain places Maoism actually forms the same. Like it fills in the gap for Trotskyism, but in France and England and the U.S., it's actually interesting. It more or less competes as a weird other sectarian form. One of the interesting things, though, that we have to look forward to, what really kills the U.S. major party of communism. It's not the Trotskyist splits; it's the Maoist ones. So when the CPUSA really starts to die, and get down to its perma-sect form of about 3,000 to 5,000, is when several different groups leave to form Maoist sectarian groups. The RCP being the first. Bob Avakian. Well, what is now Bob Avakian? Although Bob Avakian's not a founder, so there's that sectariana. For most people, this is incredibly fucking boring. One thing that we can say, Max Elbaum says, if you combined all the Trotskyist, Maoist, and official communist movements in the United States in the 70s, you would have had 1 million members, which I think may have been true, but I'm also skeptical that any organization could have ever would have ever maintained them and had that kind of mass appeal. So the idea of only we hadn't a split that we would have all stayed together. And the reason why I think that was impossible is that all these organizations, and this is one of the first things we have to talk about and what makes Trotskyism unique and maybe why it isn't relevant anymore. But all of these organizations have historically maintained the post-1921 Bolshevik faction ban.
Oh, yeah.
Which is interesting. So
you mean a ban against factions, not the banning of a Bolshevik faction?
No, the ban against factions. Factions within the Bolsheviks. So there was no longer a clear left and right opposition. There was no longer also left communist moves associated with the Bolsheviks. There was no longer other factions. This leads to the creation of the left opposition. We associate the left opposition almost purely with Trotsky. We should not. Which I kind of don't love that about Trotskyism, is it subsumes the entirety of the left opposition and the Bolsheviks. We don't talk about Zinovievism, and look, Zinoviev sucks, but we don't talk about Zinovievism. We don't talk about
what about the workers' opposition, Kollontai?
Yeah, Kollontai, the workers' opposition. Right, we don't talk about. We have trouble dealing with people like Victor Serge, are people who have more Sovietist, by Soviet I mean councilist, positions in the left opposition. Are the fact that I'm not sure that the left and right opposition, like for example, I'm gonna make a startling claim. I don't think that Bukharin actually ever fully renounced his prior left Bolshevik positions just because he thought the NEP was necessary. So associating him with the right opposition makes sense because a lot of the right opposition picks up the NEP defense, but his other positions are not coherent with the right opposition, which are more concessionary to social democracy, and Bukharin was actually absolutely not. And I think the fact that his major collaborator on two books at least, right? Who did he co-write historical materialism with? Was it the same guy?
You're talking about Preobrazhensky?
Yeah.
I don't think that. No, historical materialism is his own pen. It's ABC of Communism that's co-written with Preobrazhensky.
Is it just ABC of Communism?
Well, of the two, I think it is.
Okay. No, Preobrazhensky is associated with the left opposition, and they never denounced each other. So, but Trotsky personally fucking hated Bukharin, thought Bukharin was more dangerous than Stalin. That's a world historical mistake.
Yeah.
Whoops.
Etc. So
He just breathed that sectarian spirit out of his body and into the organizations that he founded.
Yeah.
So I guess this leads us to one of the very foundational things about Trotskyism. It maintains the 1921 Bolshevik membership constitution. It maintains the conditions of the Comintern, the 21 conditions that go out with the ABCs of communism. That is significant because that's where all the splitting comes from. Like,
that's definitely where a lot of the splitting comes from. Yeah.
I mean, now we get into the splits. There is no splitting, or there's very little splitting when Trotsky is alive. I'm not saying there's none. Actually, I think some of the splits do happen pretty early. But there is very little splitting when Trotsky is alive.
Yeah.
The other things that are unique to Trotskyism, I think we do have to talk about. One is the transitional program, but no one agrees on what that actually means.
Just the very idea of a transitional program.
Yeah. A transitional program versus the min-max program of...
Yeah.
So I guess the Second International. I've always wondered about this. Is the min-max program is maintained by Marxist-Leninist parties too after the 50s, right?
You mean the language or the deed?
The deed.
It is. It's maintained.
I think the language is too.
But I don't think that it's ever really discussed. But effectively, yes.
Like the minimum program operates within the purview of the Popular Front.
Yeah.
Like this is stuff you can demand.
There's like the weird classifications of governments from the Comintern, which includes like, you remember this, Jason, right? The workers' government. Then there's like the bourgeois government with like worker elements, and there's like a bunch of different classifications that the Comintern used to determine whether or not to allow countries as a whole to affiliate to the Comintern. Yeah. And that sort of idea kind of like, I think, becomes what the post World War II Stalinist orientation towards other countries is based on.
But what's weird about that is that
we actually have 7.
That Comintern classification system is also maintained during third periodism, where like we don't properly work with any social democrats or whatnot. And then when it's returned after, the secret speech or whatever, it's maintained also in the context of a Popular Front, which has kind of made a lot of that irrelevant.
Yeah.
So, it is where it is. But one of the things that makes this so interesting is, with the exception of the United States, in most of these areas, the official recognized Communist Party remains the biggest group, and then a Socialist Party that, somehow in spirit, usually came some lineage back to the Second International and ties to the Third Socialist International, which we have to admit there was one, or I think still is one.
Is there? I thought they were still working on the Second Socialist International.
Depending on how you classify it, it's like
it might actually be the fourth. Yeah, it's the second, or the third second international.
You remember the Fifth International?
There was the Socialist International, then there was the Labor and Socialist International.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, and then there's just and the Socialist International again, yeah.
And then there's the Socialist International again.
Yeah.
And the Socialist International. Sorry. And then the Socialist International. I mean, the Socialist International, you don't even really have to be a socialist party, or you just have to throw it in your name. Like the party of the Institutional Revolution, the centrist party of Mexico, was part of the current Socialist International.
I mean, the party that got overthrown in Tunisia a couple of years ago was also a part of the Socialist International.
Right. Which is why the DSA finally left that international in, I think, 2016, 2017.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
It was a world historic decision to leave that Socialist International.
Doesn't matter. So, and that international has not really mattered in a whole long time. Even when people talked about reaffiliating, no one in America is talking about reaffiliating with any international group beyond like a regional group, like the conference out in South America. So, okay. All this is to say that let's come up with the defining definitions that all Trotskyists at least start off with what makes them unique. A historical lineage to the left opposition, the maintaining of the faction ban, but that means you have to split a lot.
Yes.
Permanent revolution. Okay, this for me is actually when I was a post-Trot, one of the things that I just didn't understand. I was like, what do Trotskyists mean by permanent revolution? Because that seems to be like one of the first things post-Trots drop.
Well, there was sorry.
In the ISO, what we meant by it when we said it was that there's a revolutionary possibility in any form of mass struggle, and that, like, you know, the road would open into the transitional demands by virtue of, you know, socialist participation and leadership of that movement. So, like, despite the fact that it hasn't got any revolutionary aspirations, there would be some if, you know, the working class and its socialist leadership was hegemonic within it.
That's right. It has to do with the disconcatenating of the idea that there's a certain stage of efficiency in production that corresponds to the socialist transformation. Yeah. And therefore, the revolutionary struggle need not concern itself with the level of development on the ground in any given place.
And even in the ISO, there were, right around the time when I quit, and then they quit talking about stuff like this altogether, they were having an argument about whether or not the theory of permanent revolution was even relevant in.
That's right. Yeah.
You know, in our era.
I mean, clearly one of the things that I can tell you about all the post-Trotskyist organizations, because like I said, I was attached to a bunch of them, is that no, it clearly wasn't, because no one maintained. It took me a long time to get that. Part of that is to distinguish it from the Marxist-Leninist, and this is a later Marxist-Leninist, but is maintained kind of by official Marxist-Leninist parties like the Communist Party USA, the Communist Party of France, and definitely by Maoist parties, is the stage theory of revolution, which is first political, then economic, then social. I think that's the order in which it goes. Or maybe it's first political, then social, then economic. I'm never quite sure what order they put it in. And when Mao was actually being his most radically experimental was during a social revolution, and that's when he was doing the most for economics. So I don't get it. But that's
probably right. Yeah.
That's the argument. Like, there's also a great proletarian social revolution in the USSR, and everyone forgets that it existed because apparently it didn't change anything. So there's,
sometimes you just have to name a period.
Yeah.
Right. So there's that. distinction. There's also the transitional program, which I've mentioned now a bunch of times. No Trotskyist groups really agree on what it is. I'm actually going to say that, even though there was a formal program released by Trotsky, which has one of my favorite things about it is it has predictions in it that are wrong. Like it predicts actually the same as the Marxists and Leninists did. That communism was about to be dominant because the old dynamics of pre-war capitalism were going to kick in, and there was going to be an immediate crisis to end all capitalism, like almost happened in 1929. It's now going to happen in the 50s, and everybody is wrong about that because they don't see how capital is evolving its management. But which is one of the first problems. But that's actually in the transitional program, right? It actually says like we're going to be in a communist horizon by the end of the 50s because of a capitalist crisis. That the economic element of Trotskyism is interesting because Trotsky, I'm going to say this nicely, and it's going to make a lot of Trotskyists mad, but Trotsky was an economic moron. In my opinion, like he doesn't have that, like it's not that big in his analysis of things. It does come up in the transitional program, but not much anywhere else, actually. And in the transitional program, he's actually recapitulating Soviet doctrine.
I mean, I think that's why, right? Like, because he didn't have to be the economy guy in the USSR. And so that question was solved for the rest of capitalism's history, which could only be another couple months, another couple years, maybe.
Right.
Well, there is a moment when he does literally have to be the economics guy, and that's when he's sent to the central planning, briefly before he's booted out. But I take this point to be even broader than that, and I'll go a step further, which is to say that Trotsky himself does not distinguish himself as a theorist at any level. He distinguishes himself as a rhetorician, as a military commander, and as a historian, but not necessarily as a political economist, and not as a political theorist of any stand. Even if the theory of permanent revolution is thinner than anything, for example, in Marx. I'm reminded of like two titles that when I was reading up for this episode, I put next to one another.
Stuff in Mao, even, which I think was pretty damning.
I mean,
at least Mao tried to become a philosopher.
That's something to quibble over because the whole Russian Revolution is based upon what the permanent revolution is about. So that's just that's hard to deny.
Sure, but let's put two things next to one another. So there's Luxemburg looking at Lenin and saying, and I know this is an apocryphal title, right? But Marxism or Leninism, polemically. And there are lots of titles that are Leninism or Trotskyism. Yeah. And you can tell the Marxism just falls out of the pot because the topic has changed. The topic has gone from a series of theoretical commitments that cash out as political decisions to a series of political affiliations that cash out as institutional affiliations.
Yeah, that's right. That's entirely right. Yeah.
So
I just mean to say that the idea that like a minority working class could lead a majority peasantry and still make a workers' revolution is theoretically a little bit heavier than you were giving it credit for.
Yeah.
But also that's the only way that it is. Like the permanent revolution as a broader concept doesn't mean anything at all.
All right. So the few other distinctions, and before we talk about the Klein Trotsky and understand what Trotskyism is, that are unique to Trotskyists but maintain. One, a preference for the United Front, but a specific form of the United Front. Let's go into that because there's the United Front from above and the United Front from below. And then there's also what's the specific formulation of the United Front that the USSR adopts about self-censorship that's new?
I don't know.
I forget the name for it. And one of the videos I'm going to link in the show notes, Mac McNair calls it what it is. But there's a distinction when that kind of moves the United Front into what would become the Popular Front. It's first tried out on Comintern advice to China and their relationship with the Kuomintang.
Oh yeah, that worked out real great for everybody involved.
Yeah. Yes. But there's, which means United Front, but you censor your own members through democratic centralism, so that they don't break the front, even if they're stating an actual position of the communist organization that they're in. Trotskyism maintains the Second International, early Third International position of United Front from above strategy and United Front from below. So United Front from above is, we will join with parties to use specific actions, but will not join a government with them. Now, that's a weird distinction in the United States because that's literally fucking impossible to do. It's just like, it's not even on the table. It's one of the problems with like not just Trotskyists, but everybody's orientations coming out of Europe when they hit the United States and they don't have a parliamentary party system to deal with. It actually kind of makes the popular front, even as understood there, is irrelevant, because part of the issue with the popular front is you are supposed to maintain a distinct party identity even if you're joining in coalition governments with progressive bourgeois parties, but you can't maintain a distinct party identity in the United States. And when you try to, you end up being the CPUSA, which like has almost no electoral clout since the 40s.
Yeah. I mean, I think key is the idea that the institution that you're a part of that is cooperating with other institutions has to be of substantial size to throw your weight around and not be completely subsumed by the ones that you're in coalition with. In the United States, that's not possible if the groups that you're in coalition with are affiliated to the Democratic Party.
All right. So we've gotten those key features of Trotskyism out. Also, according to Marxist-Leninists, we're all secret fascists.
That's true. Yeah.
And what else do they say about us? We're bourgeois idealists as well.
Wreckers.
Yeah, I've been called a wrecker, so
terrorists. Destroying copper mines. That's my favorite thing to do. It's why I became a Trotskyist.
Just go to the strip. But okay, all that silliness aside, now we have to talk about the theoretical innovations that start causing the splits before we get to like the current decline.
Yeah.
So the first question that comes up is, and this happens when Trotsky is still alive, is what is the nature of the Soviet Union, of which we need to maintain our left oppositions as a separate identity, not as like trying to renew a faction. And then, are we going to be defensist or not in regards to either the USSR and US and Soviet aligned countries? Are we taking a third campus, or are we going to even endorse capitalist aggression against them? The latter position is actually an extreme minority in the Trotskyist movement, but if you were listening to Marxist-Leninists, you would think that's what they all believed. But this leads you to have to theorize what the fuck the Soviet Union actually is and why it has deviated from its revolutionary past. And now we already have, there's already a couple of traditions that have already tried this before Trotskyism does. There's the basic big social democrats, which, blah, 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 Lenin's a dictator. All right. Usually that comes out of the fact that they get bitter about not being able to meet the 21 conditions, and they get even more mad about social fascism. And yeah, I get it. Like, both socialist and communist end up in fucking camps in Central Europe because they're killing each other over this shit, and then the fascists come and get them both.
Yeah.
So I have to remind people that like communist and socialist rank and file were killing each other in Europe over this. Just a reminder, they were killing each other in Europe over this. So a lot of the bad blood is not just theoretical. It's like, you killed my friend.
Yeah.
So
And in the instance of the German SPD, they actually hired out the Free Corps, like right-wing paramilitaries, to kill communists.
Right. Now, interestingly, it's not. A lot of people think that that's the Kautsky-Bernstein faction that does that. It's not. It's the Ebert faction, which, by the way, the right and the the people that Lenin split with aren't even the right wing of the SPD. Like the right wing of the SPD is way the fuck scarier.
That's right. In fact, Kautsky has nothing but horrible words to say about the right wing of the SPD or the yeah, it's important to remember that. But even in Spain, during the Spanish Civil War, you had Stalinists and Trotskyists. You had Stalinists rounding up and shooting Trotskyists who had even fought on the side of the Republicans.
Right, yeah.
I mean, this was look. It matters, by the way, and it's one of the things that is really potentially distracting about focusing exclusively on like positions, which is what's at stake in being a Trotskyist in various moments in history just really changes. You began with the question, why does it even survive 1991?
Yeah.
Which is a good question we should come back to.
Well, I mean, this is what I'm trying to build to, because that's what we have to ask when we talk about the decline is like, well, if this question of positions emerges, but it comes out of very real people killing each other. And I know I'm going to I know some of my positions are unpopular. For example, I tend to be a Soviet defensist. And I think some of the stuff that Trotsky said he would have done as a leader of the Soviet Union would have been just as disastrous as what Stalin did. So like
some of it was what Stalin did.
Yeah, right. And so Trotskyists get real mad when I say that. But I also don't deny that people were killing each other over this in active like conflicts because of like stances on how you did the United Front. That's what that divide is in the Republican Army in Spain. It's like how you maintain the United Front and who you're willing to work with. So there's that. So the theories, there's what Trotsky says. Trotsky kind of floats a bunch of ideas, actually, like, which is why most of Trotskyists can kind of claim that their theories about this are tied to Trotsky, except for the last one. So there is the basic three positions. The Orthodox Trotskyist position is that the Soviet Union is defensible, but it's a deformed worker state. Why it is deformed, however, even with an Orthodox Trotskyist, is actually still an open question. Whether or not it's Bonapartism or something else. A version of deformed worker state separates from it, and that is a bureaucratic collectivist critique, which becomes parallel to the new class critique out of Yugoslavia. And I've always found it weird because I'm like, I've never really completely understood how both the deformed worker state and bureaucratic collectivism couldn't be both true. I guess the idea, the difference is bureaucratic collectivism posits that the bureaucrats are a strata that has effectively become a class.
Yeah, it's a firmly entrenched ruling class strata.
Right.
Absolutely, yeah.
Whereas the deformed worker state is like, well, there's a Bonapartist structure, but that could go away.
Yeah.
But those are just degrees, like if there was any real basis for either one of those groups kind of existing, they would have found a basis for,
and this is what
papering over that difference.
This is what starts the first round of splits within Trotskyists, which is the difference between bureaucratic collectivists and deformed worker state theory. Now, several times out of the bureaucratic collective class, but separately in Europe, Tony Cliff around the Vietnam War, you start having people pick up what was formerly a left communist position or a Marxist humanist position, depending, of state capitalism.
Right.
Yeah.
However, again, these are under theorized because the theories of why the Soviet Union is state capitalist is wildly different. And some of them are really hard to maintain when like the early ones are about the NEP, and that's been over since like what, like 1931 or something, like.
Yeah.
So
the Cliffite one is literally just about the fact that surplus labor is being extracted by a class that isn't the working class and kept. So that's what makes it state capitalist. Has nothing to do with markets, has nothing to do with anything
Surplus
except
value.
surplus value. Yeah.
I remember one time, I'm not gonna name this person, but a person who was very high up in the ISO said to me, he was like, "Well, so okay, the worker state was deformed until there was a bureaucratic collective ruling class, managing state capitalism. Why can't all three of those things
I
just be the
actually
same?"
my whole life I'm like,
Ew.
those are actually describing different elements of the system
Yeah.
itself. But what is really undergirding those distinctions is how defensist you're going to be of the Soviet Union.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's what's at stake.
Yeah.
So what's at stake is, do we defend the Soviet Union against Western aggression or not? Which is where the whole anarchist and right-wing deviations from Trotskyism come from, and why, the paleocon, why Marxist-Leninists love to actually pick up the paleocon conspiracy theories that all the Trotskyists became neoconservatives, even though Maoists also did that, but they don't talk about it. But there is a real tendency, in a specific subset of tendencies. It goes from like Shachtman to Sidney Hook, from Sidney Hook into Sidney Hook students in the Congress for Cultural Freedom. But there's also Burnham, who leaves early on, who's a bureaucratic collectivist, who is like the father of both neoconservatism and parts of paleoconservatism, and kind of sets up the Congress for Cultural Freedom and stuff like that. But there's also a whole lot of right oppositionist defectors from the Socialist Party that get tied into that. So to blame it all on Trotskyism is utterly misleading.
It's just lazy.
I have had Trotskyists who try to claim that Shachtman was never a Trotskyist, and I'm like, only if you do the no true trot. Like, anyone who is not an orthodox trot isn't really a trot line. But
yeah, I mean, he was not. If the fact that he was a leader of the Communist Party and then a leader of the Socialist Workers Party and like met Trotsky and whatever, like if you don't count those things, then sure, yeah, he wasn't a Trotskyist. Right. But if those things don't count, then that means that no one ever was a Trotskyist.
Yeah, also that'd be true for Cannon, the U.S. Trotskyist.
That would also be true for Trotsky.
Yeah, Trotsky doesn't count as a Trotskyist, which I've actually kind of tried to make that argument before. So the defensism question, and there's like, so we have the three justification theories for why we are or aren't, right? We just talked about those, but then there's defensist, third campist, and anti-defensist or even anti-communist Trotskyism that emerges. Now, I will point out that I think the anti-communist, anti-defensist line is pretty fucking rare.
Well, and also like,
but it does exist.
At a certain point, it stops being Trotskyism. Just it stops having much to do with it. So, like if you were making a chart, you could draw that line. You just fade out.
Well, I've seen the chart, and it does. Like it that's a decision. Like we now are dealing with something that's mutated into something else.
Okay, yeah.
But they also talk about the ultra left or left communist deviations as mutating into something else too. So that's what the debate's about. So this leads us to my first question. Why the fuck was there still Trotskyists after 1992? Because as Mike McNair points out in the book Revolutionary Strategy, they were all, with the minor exception of maybe the Marcyites, wrong about what was going to happen in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
None of their theories or their positions on defensism ended up mattering.
Yeah. I mean, by 91, 92, by that point, any actual reason for a distinct kind of communism has already been kind of dead for like a couple of decades. And they're just existing because, a tiny handful of people make their living off of running whatever weird sect. And if they were to all merge into one macro sect, then they would have to, I don't know, find jobs or something.
So what's interesting about this is also one of the things I will say about this is most of the, like, yes, the US SWP I think still technically exists, and I found like Pathfinder. I find interesting like Pathfinder Press stuff like outside of the United States more than I find it inside the United States, which is pretty funny.
Didn't they sell the Pathfinder Press?
Like, yeah, but the Pathfinder tendency still exists. Anyway, so
there are dozens of them at least.
Yeah, dozens.
But one of the things about the post 1992, let's think about the Trotskyist organizations that actually are still around. Solidarity, I don't know when they start, but they're still around.
I think they start in like 83.
Okay.
They split off of the Jack Barnes and Mary Alice Waters SWP, and then they bring in is that correct? And then they bring in
part
some
of
other
them,
elements,
yeah,
because of the hard like third worldist pro Stalin turn that the SWP takes. I think in the early 80s.
Yeah. The 83, I think, is the year.
So there's that. There is the Northites, who are small, and that's the Socialist Equity Party in the United States.
There might even be a dozen of them.
But the thing is, they have staying power. Don't mock them. They're just one of the few. They're still around.
I'm mocking them because they're still around.
Yeah. But the interesting thing about them, though, is they're actually even hard to categorize according to our current schema, because they take a mixture of. They take a lot of ultra left positions, actually.
They really do, yeah. I mean, a bunch of like sort of identity issue based issues that they take are incredibly ultra left.
Well, and also like they disagree with one thing that at least I might consider to be fundamental when it comes to Trotsky's political strategy, which is trade unions. They won't have anything to do with them.
Right.
Which would, I think, that would disqualify you.
So they take the same position as trade unions as councilists. They actually take a harder position than Bordigas do.
Yeah.
So the Northites are still around. I don't know when they start. They must have been in the 80s. The ISO is still around, but the nature of the ISO has changed. It's incredibly taken on the character of the British Cliffites, which is not its origin.
And you mean in 1991?
Yeah.
Okay.
Even as early as 1991, we're seeing like this British strain really becoming dominant.
Yeah.
So we have Solidarity, we have the ISO, we have the Socialist Equity Party. This one's real small, but they hit above their weight with their weird website and publication, so we can't ignore that. Who else is around in 92? I guess the WWP is still around. It's like I think at that point they're still important because they end up becoming the basis of like International Answer and whatnot.
Right, and they haven't. Is that before the split?
They split in the early aughts.
They split in 2005.
Yeah.
Oh wow, that late.
Yeah.
Okay, so they split from the Workers' World Party to the Workers' World Party and the
Party for Socialism and Liberation.
The pumpkin spice latte.
Right.
Both of those things too. Socialism and liberation.
Yeah. Party for Socialism and Liberation. That split is not ideological, even really initially. It's about control.
It's clearly not, yeah.
It's about control over resources of a party in California and relationship over resources to International Answer. But I think at this point, there's no like if you go to the WWP or the PSL now, they literally pick up like 1930s and Marxist-Leninist curriculum and start with that, and then like they have a lot of ties to official Chinese communism and whatnot.
Yeah.
But in this time period, I think they're still Trotskyists. There's no from their own conception, they're still Trotskyists. So that's 4 left. Who else is left? Solidarity and the militant. The militant faction and SALT and all that hadn't come over yet.
No,
right?
You said the SWP, right? The American SWP.
Yeah, the American SWP is still around, but right.
Oh, the Freedom Socialist Party. which is a split out of the SWP, and it's based on Marxist feminism and
Yeah,
that's
okay.
right.
and socialist action also.
And socialist actions around, right? Yeah.
And I think the group that becomes the League for the Revolutionary Party, because it's like half a dozen guys who think that the state capitalism thesis is right, but it's not a step. But that's a step forward, not a step sideways.
So okay, so the other thing that's still around, the League for the Revolutionary Party, and then I haven't mentioned the Sparts.
Oh,
and
yeah.
the Spart splits. I don't know when the IBT starts to exist, but the Sparts are definitely still around. Okay.
What's the end of that period, by the way? Okay, so you say what's the organization still around in 92? When is the end of the period where it just doesn't seem relevant? Is it 2008, 2009?
I'd say it's 99.
I
Yeah?
actually say we start seeing the ISO and solidarity, and then start to regain actually out of the alter globalization movement, believe it or not.
And it's like the ISO tailing the Green Party brings in a lot of membership. And in fact, I think the biggest their membership ever is probably after the first Ralph Nader campaign.
Yeah.
And then it fluctuates and
Yeah,
stays
it
right
never breaks 2,000, and it fluctuates somewhere around between 800 and 1,500 for the rest of time. But 99, that was really the year, because there was the Labor Party that was founded in 96 that people in the ISO were very involved in, and they were very proud of and happy about. And also the alter globalization movement and the Green Party, like those factors all combine into, that's with the ISO's moment.
That's when the ISO gets booted from the SWP, is over the alter globalization movement, because the ISO wanted to maintain an orientation of building socialist politics within the alter globalization movement, and the SWP wanted to change it up and talk more about anti-capitalism and try to have like a broader appeal.
Yeah, honestly, particularly in regards to, frankly, Islamist movements in Europe. Like, that was specifically part of the debate.
Yeah.
So different kinds of opportunism leads to a split. But what's funny about this is the IS tradition, because the ISOs come from the IS tradition, but the IST is really dominated by the UK SWP. That domination of like the Tony Cliff faction, as opposed to the old Shackmanite Draperite faction, maintains after they're kicked out in the 90s. So the alter globalization movement leads to this growth. I think it's also interesting that the ISO has ties to other English-speaking sects of significant size in Australia,
in Canada,
yeah. So that maintains for a while. Interestingly, I think the beginning of the ISO's decline comes from Occupy.
Definitely.
But the other thing that happens is not the ISO's fault, but there's all these really kind of nasty sex scandals out of the UK SWP.
Right.
Well, and also,
then the ISO has its own, but
a part of this is also like, so Occupy created a moment that the ISO was not prepared for. Part of that moment was that Socialist Alternative finally got, Shama Sawant elected, which means they finally stepped onto the stage, and the ISO was like very, very protective of that stage, and they refused any kind of collaboration. Like, I remember actually in Socialism 2014, in preparing for it, I was making the case to bring Shama Sawant in order to do the panel on elections.
I mean, it was
and they were like, no, we can't do that.
It was crazy how weirdly sectarian the ISO got. They were attacking me all the time. I remember they used to like comb my blog just to make my life hard.
I never did that.
I don't know. I mean, it was someone within the leadership, because my affiliation with these two post-Trotskyist organizations made me, both Platypus and North Star, made me persona non grata.
Yeah, I probably didn't like you and just didn't know you, but just like I didn't like the concept that you embodied, you know?
Yeah. So there's that. The IMT, I think, is also becoming more important
Yeah, in the mid-aughts.
in the mid-aughts.
I remember coming across. They had 2 members in North Texas, and they tried to start a chapter there.
Actually, they made an appeal that they would bring the IMT into the ISO, but only if the ISO would affiliate to that international that the IMT was a part of.
Right.
I remember just thinking that like I would not have a more useless conversation with anyone.
And this was after the ISO dropped their state capitalism requirement for membership.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because the IMT, the Woods the Alan Woods IMT is so very British, but has its own. Well, I guess it doesn't actually, does it? So all this happens. The ISO interestingly hits above its weight, even though it's pretty big for a sectarian organization. How's it hit above its weight? It has Haymarket Press.
Yeah.
It has
And
the
it's-
ISR, which is very well distributed, and it
Pretty
has
good sometimes.
It has a fair amount of money, which I don't understand how that happened exactly, but it has like.
I mean, a lot of it was because of the regime that we had around selling the newspaper. Like, we didn't just sell the newspaper; every individual member bought newspapers, and then they went and sold those papers separate from the paper sales.
Yeah, and then we were basically like the Haymarket Street team. We would like
Yeah.
anytime there was an event of any size, we would do free labor for Haymarket books. On top of the fact that they the dues were pretty significant.
Yeah, they were
heavy.
like really, really heavy.
Yeah, and
the
were-
ISO was so expensive that I wouldn't join it when I was looking,
Yeah.
when I was shopping for stuff.
And
when
it
I was
was-
still in America.
It was $20 a month, and that was the cheapest that
Right.
the dues could be. That was
And it
like
was
basically
campus-based.
hardship dues. Yeah.
it was campus based, so you had a revolving membership of like free labor of idealistic college students.
So older millennials and younger Gen Xers, when I meet them, if I meet their introduction to Marxism, the vast majority of them either come from the ISO or the Sparts.
Yeah.
Which, and then the IMT starts growing in the aughts. They do a lot of internet outreach. They're just better at it. For some reason, they jump on that pretty early. They also, like, in contradistinction to the ISO, really double down on anti-identity politics, like more than almost anybody else, except for the Northites. Like, they're like, well, we can have Marxist feminism, but we don't have any of this feminism bullshit. We can have, like,
That's what the ISO
That's
used to
Clara's
say.
Nickens position.
yeah. So that's the IMT's growth. They also have a strong base in Canada, and they've had it for a while.
The craziest thing about that group is like they exist because of the split in the socialist alternative, whatever, CWI, because they're the group that wanted to stay involved in the Labor Party after Tony Blair.
Right.
And that means that like the US section was just founded by a guy from the UK who moved to the US. And he was like, well, I can't just join a US group. I'll found a US chapter of the group I was in.
Right.
And that's it. Like they don't have I don't think they ever have had a single ideological difference from the socialist alternative, except for the fact that they're the American version of the group in Britain.
So the other thing that this ties us to, though, is SALT, which is also the militant tendency is not from the United States.
Right. Yeah.
It's imported. Why are all these British? What is about? One question I'm going to ask Stephan, Chris, and Jason. What about the post-alter globalization moment makes British Trotskyism in specific so fucking attractive that it's the dominant way people encounter Marxism in the aughts and in early teens, at least up until right after Occupy.
You know, everything's imported in the United States. Most socialism is imported in the United States. Marxism is imported in the United States through foreign language.
Canaanite Trotskyism is not imported.
Sure.
There's
Well,
a
I
straight
mean, it's
line.
imported in the sense that Cannon has to go meet Trotsky and then bring Trotskyism back to the United States, I guess.
Yes, true. But I mean, like, but Cannon's an interesting figure because of all the Trotskyists we met. He was in all the parties. He's in the SPA. He's in the CPUSA.
And the IWW before the SPA.
Yeah, he's in the IWW. He has a line I mean, he's a comrade of Debs until that's irrelevant.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think the answer to your question can just be found in the fact that like Americans mostly just only speak English. And so like Argentines, Brazilians, they can't have a foothold in the same way that British people can.
So no, I agree with you on that. Although Mandel was always popular in the United States and he's not part of the US.
That's true.
Belgium.
But why is specifically why is there a turn? This is also actually always interested me because it's over now. Yeah. This is done. But for a long time, the British left, not the Canadian left, also speaks English fucking closer to us. The British left is where a lot of American left ideas that aren't tied to the CPUSA come from. And what makes this even weirder is during the ultra globalization movement, the WWP and the PSL really grow. That's because they're in charge of international answer. But early on, they're also cooperating with the ISO. Like during the anti-war movement, they are.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Yeah. Honestly, speaking anecdotally, I would say that when people first started using the internet to find people to be politically affiliated to, the ones that would show up were the American versions of the British counterparts that were in the United States. So like I found, Socialist Alternative, I found CWI, I found the ISO, all on the internet. This is all just true. On the internet. And they responded to you when you asked them questions, unlike the IWW or the Socialist Party. Because they had, I think, the backing of people in Great Britain or whatever, they had publications coming out all the time. They had books that were specifically, you have a question about this. Well, there's a guy in England who wrote this book. Check it out, And it was just resources were easily available, and on top of that, they were everywhere.
Whereas the U.S. Communist Party was a joke during this time, and during this time period, and specific. That's where I was like, you might as well just fucking be a Democrat. The DSA was also a joke.
It was even a bigger joke. Somehow a bigger joke, yeah.
But the DSA maintained 5,000 members for 20 years, but they maintained those members. I think they fluctuated between 4,000 and 5,000, but
that has a lot to do with conditions of membership as well, being very lax.
Right, and they still are.
Yeah, because by that definition, the ISO should have been like 30,000, but in reality, the DSA was probably about 10 people who were really active for decades.
Right. So then SALT happens. Go ahead, Stephan.
No, I'm just gonna say, just at a slightly higher level of elevation, it's got to be the case that why didn't Marxism just die in 1991?
Yeah.
And and I think there are two things that it has going for it. On the one hand, it has just the power of its it's Marxism, right? Just the explanatory power of Marxism and its intellectual credibility, which remains, at least in some circles, undiminished. And then and the second thing is some muscle memory around what it's like to form an organization in the first place.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it maintains the flame of Marxism until such time when it all. I mean, if there's an end date for me, it's the growth period in the DSA, because then at least there is a replacement. There is a plausible. I mean, I think everyone, maybe except for Varn, but everyone in the room had to join the DSA at some point, no matter what our trajectory was.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I mean,
I absolutely refuse to fucking join the DSA.
Well, you were right.
it didn't matter either
also-
way for me.
It's not.
It's
That's right
also
or wrong
the
is not
case
the
that,
point.
like,
All of these groups, they were all founded and maintained by a certain generation of people. And like, 10 years from now, I don't think that. Well, whatever. I don't think that they'll be around.
Well, so we're not this we haven't really answered any questions about why, but we have gone over the conditions that in a very brief, and we haven't dealt with the 60s and 70s, which are both the high point of the Trotskyist organizations, but also that's split mania, and that's why we skipped it, because it's like
Yeah.
like that's when like everyone is splitting into everything like every 35 seconds in the 70s, but because
That has a
basically-
lot to do
Mhm.
with the FBI.
Yeah, there's that too. That's also true for the Maoist organizations. Maoist organizations are
Yes,
rife with
absolutely.
COINTELPRO too.
Yeah.
what I-
actually, the first Maoist organization was founded by the FBI. So,
What I fucking love about COINTELPRO is when they kill people, with the exception of the Panthers. Panthers is the exception. When they kill people, it's always an accident because they got local cops involved. like that's every time I've read, I'm like, they asked the local cop, oh fuck, someone's gonna get gun happy, and now someone's dead. But most of what the COINTELPRO does is just bring out natural splits that already exist in the organization.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
COINTELPRO did
exactly
not
right.
invent splitting. There was a moment where, I mean, I think again, historical context matters a lot. When when the international communist movement splits in the wake of the Russian Revolution for any number of reasons, the American Party, take the American Party, they take a fraction of the militant working class with them.
Yes.
Even when Ryan CLR James split at the John Forstency splits with the SWP, they take a fraction of its worker membership with them.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's just not what happens in the 60s and 70s. You get these sort of cult of personalities emerging and the rest of it, even though structurally, historically, there's still some hope that the basic Trotskyist, vision, which is to wrest control over the international communist movement, is still at least plausible, or at least in some level viable, when there's no longer a communist movement. Not only is it not a main, even close to the mainstream of the international labor movement, et cetera, when there's just no Soviet Union anymore, it becomes just a maintenance boat, just a lifeboat, really, just a life raft.
Well, the one thing we have to
Yeah.
notice about the ISO and then this period post 1992, but even in the 60s, because the new left by this point, when they try to enter workers' organizations, they're trying to salt those organizations. They are not organically emerging from them
Right.
anymore.
That's exactly right. I mean, when the ISO was first founded, it was like entirely within the Teamsters Union,
Right.
but that didn't last.
It was the
very
IS
long.
back then, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so when the ISO founded itself, it took the Teamsters out of the IS. But then it was like a tiny group of people until they stopped being a part of the working class.
I mean, and this is when Hal Drapo writes his Anatomy of the Microsect critique of what he
Yeah.
sees, and just is like, look, if you're going to do that, you might as well just write. Don't try to maintain these sects. Just communist theorize until there's a better working class movement which was my position. Like I was
It's
associated
a
with
reasonable position, yeah.
I was associated with the Draperite Marxist Center, which is center in the term of a center away from sectarian organizations, as opposed to the Neo-Kautskyite Marxist Center, which is a center of an international communist movement, which doesn't exist. So
Not yet.
so
Hold on.
so anyway, to get into this, I mean, it's funny. It's actually kind of funny when you look at like where they put like on the flowchart I'm looking at, like how Draper becomes like a sect of one, basically in 1971. But
for all his railing against microsects, he becomes a nanosect.
Right, and then there's like the Love and Rage Network and stuff like that, which are also tied to Draper, but they are anarchists. They just give up on they give up on Marxism. Yeah. That creates people like Ron Tabor, who wrote The Tyranny of Theory and stuff like that. So and Wayne Price, my favorite anarchist, because he's basically a Marxist. But that gets us into the aughts. One of the things I think we need to know, we've already moved in the 70s that we kind of skipped over for the mercy of everybody. I guess we have to come back there eventually.
Yeah.
But we are going to note that Stephan is right. One thing happens that really happens. The tendency of the new left, and this is not unique to Trotskyism, to focus on students gets pronounced.
Yeah.
And the organizations that survived that we mentioned in 1991 all have that's the Sparts and the ISO, and to a lesser degree the SEP, etc., are heavily campus organizations. You do not encounter them that much off of campus. That's how they recruit.
Right. Yeah.
Part of that is the changing nature of the left and like the Gen X left, which is a post new left phenomenon. But like the globalization movement, I was the alter globalization, anti-globalization movement that radicalized and also conservatized me. But it was like even though I was working class, I was a working class kid and got pulled into it from zines. Like not from any traditional labor organizing, not from organizing. I got put into what would, it was a tendency of media that kind of presages what we saw with the internet.
Right. I mean, that was us too. Like at zines from punk shows were how I got my early political education. And
actually, I had 2 copies of the ISR that I got from somebody that our band played a show with in another city.
Yeah, that's right.
Before I ever met the ISO.
I remember
I met the ISO at a demonstration.
We were reading those ISRs while we were on tour.
Yeah.
And we were like, well, hey, they have a branch in Austin. We should look those guys up when we get back.
Yeah.
So, but critically, we did not meet them because we were, unpacking boxes in the warehouse.
Yeah. No. So my point is the part of it that's not students is subcultural. So again, post new left weird ties to counterculture, which I actually found the new left ties to counterculture to be kind of a myth when you actually look at it, but people believed it. By the 1990s, that's actually true.
Yeah.
Like these leftist organizations are spreading through subcultural polemics and like, well, you want something stronger than gutter punks. So what are you gonna do? Well, there's your Trotskyism on the.
Well, yeah, it's gonna piss off your parents.
Yep.
And
that's
even more than your haircut.
The official hat of Trotskyism, that they say it's like the scally cap with the button, right?
Yeah.
They say it's the official hat of Trotskyism. It's because all of those Trots came out of the punk scene, and that's what all the punk kids wore.
Yes, but they look like they look like they were Fugazi fans.
Yeah.
Like,
I still wear that hat.
Me too. But
that's because you guys are really just still haven't exercised your Trotskyism yet, like you said you did. If that's what gives you Trotskyism, it's those hats. It gets in your head from.
Well,
it's like a whatever. It's like a reverse shield of armor.
Yeah.
It's like the One Ring.
So we now have to hurry up because I only have about 8 minutes left. But I want to talk about what happens very quickly in the aught teens. SALT emerges big and seemingly from nowhere. It has no ties, as we said. Neither it nor the IMT have any ties to, quote, indigenous Trotskyism. This is not a split from anything that comes off canon, which everything else we've mentioned, even the Northites, are.
Yeah.
So that leads us to this weird thing. Why did that happen? And 2 things. Occupy happens. The ISO is ill prepared to handle it for whatever reason. And Kasama Sawant has a successful campaign in Seattle, and not only successful. I shit on a lot of SALT who get really misty-eyed about Kasama Sawant's post first year campaign, but her first year she actually does shit.
Yeah,
like
they also almost won a similar victory in Minneapolis.
Right,
they came within like 400 votes, and so they almost really did matter a lot.
So this happens. at the exact same time across the pond, the US SWP, I mean the UK SWP, excuse me, fucking. The other thing with Trots is like at least Maoists give their organizations ridiculous names, so they're easy to tell apart. So
except for the two Freedom Road Socialist organizations.
yeah, but I mean, like Monkey Smashes Heaven is easy to remember.
Yes. Shining Path.
Our
Leading Lights
yeah. Leading Lights Communist Organization. You remember the LLCO?
Yeah.
So anyway, so having nothing to do with this does have downstream effects is around the aught tens. There's a bunch of sex scandals out of the UK SWP that's really, really damaging. But there's a bunch of splits that kind of leave Trotskyism altogether over it. It
resplits the ISO from the SWP, who were in the process.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The other issue that you have is Galloway happens.
George.
Oh yeah.
George Galloway, and you have this increasing time with the SWP with Islamists, and it gets more and more seemingly tied up into like conservative Islamic politics in the UK, which is a big tension in the US too. And then the Arab Spring happens, and I'm just gonna say the IST gets fucked in the Middle East, because one of the things we have to admit that the IST actually has people in the Middle East, which is not true for most other Trotskyist organizations. And they get screwed in the Arab Stream. Like there's a body count there.
Yeah.
So all this happens.
We were getting updates on the ground from people that were affiliated to the tendency.
Mm-hmm.
So
and then
they disappear.
Haymarket. Yeah, a lot of them are probably in a prison across the street from where I used to live. I'm not even joking.
Yeah. I remember you saying something about that.
Yeah, the political prison was literally across the street from where I lived. I couldn't take pictures in front of my own apartment because I would be accidentally taking pictures of the political prison. It's fucked up dystopian shit. But all that happens. They're flat-footed on Occupy. Sanders happens. Now, this leads us to a question.
That's a really big thing. Yeah.
Sanders also fucks SALT because SALT won't drop its Orthodox Trotskyism to fully get on board with Sanders. So they can't replicate what they did with Khassam Sawant. So SALT, if you meet like older millennial people who get into Marxism, they come in usually from the WWP or the PSL. But that really starts later. Are they coming through SALT? There's just I knew a ton of people who first encountered me who were post SALT who came in after Sawant. Now I'm abroad at this point. I'm also salty and beginning to be fed up with all you fucking Trotskyists at this point in my life. But so that happens, and the DSA reemerges. Now the DSA never made sense to me as where the clearinghouse became, except that Bhaskar Sankara and had made that choice. He was given a lot of choices. He flirted with other organizations with Jacobin, and Bernie Sanders has historically been in the DSA since like the fucking 80s. So
it's a lot of things, but one thing that's not normally discussed is that the Jacobin reading groups, which before they were founded, I remember Bhaskar was giving a talk at a socialism conference, and they were going to be the basis of a revived socialist movement. They were like the organizing center, and then eventually they become branches of whatever group. Turned out to be the DSA.
It was a model.
Yeah, it was a very successful. It just didn't matter, but it was successful.
Interestingly, it has ties to the Jacobin reading book. Actually, does have direct lineage ties to the Platypus Affiliated Society.
That was of the first political stuff that I did for after having quit the ISO for years was founding a Jacobin reading group with Jason.
Yeah, that's right.
There's also some parallelism. I mean, I have not that the reason why everyone entered the the DSA was just a homonym. You had the word democratic socialism out there, and people were looking for something that had that name. Although I acknowledge there is some, I guess, institutional tie. Although Bernie Sanders didn't trumpet his membership in the DSA and still doesn't, if he even is a member of the DSA now. What's interesting is that the DSA's electoral strategy now looks a lot, which is one in defeat, crafted in defeat, looks a lot like the original SALT strategy, which is electoralism, but at the municipal level and trying to reverse engineer a constituency by virtue of victories. So now we have two SALTs.
Yeah. Well, except SALT, the issue. So what happens? The DSA itself, arguably, and I'm gonna now go through my argument for why the DSA is actually a post-Trotskyist organization. The DSA itself emerges from the Shachtman split. The Shachtman split with the non-Trotskyists in splits into two groups or three groups. There's the Social Democratic USA. There is the Socialist Party of America, which people forget about. Socialist Party USA, which is trying to recapitulate the multi-tendency Socialist Party, but refuses to work with Democrats. That was where I come from, really.
Which is like Solidarity, except for that it has a different name.
Yeah, the difference between that, I will defend the Socialist Party on one thing. There is no faction ban, so there were tendencies in it.
Right.
But the funny thing about Trotskyism that we haven't covered is sometime in the 70s, even though they maintain the faction ban, they start seeing themselves as their only viability as tendencies within already existing parties. Like they're no longer trying to make their own workers' party. They're now like, well, we have to maintain a socialist tendency out that enters into a workers' party, or has some kind of united front strategy with the Democrats. Now, and I think ultimately, in my grand durée that we've had to rush through this, and we haven't even talked about the key points.
We'll pick it up again
later.
But
in my grand durée, what happens is all these factions, with the exception of the people who are tied to, so the SPUSA still exists and still has its own stuff, but all the other factions liquidate very quickly after the ISO dissolves. And the reason why the ISO dissolves is nominally sex scandals, but I also think it's because their ties to Haymarket books meant that they had to have corporate accountability practices, which is why the sex scandals were finally handled, which dissolves the organization.
Yeah.
And so,
and also because there was not a new layer of young people to join because they were all going into the DSA.
So you have this post-Trotskyist Social Democratic faction, and then in it, around 2020, between 2019 and 2020, they see that the DSA doesn't have a regional organization, and all these caucuses have been emerging, starting with actually like an anarchist caucus, the left social, libertarian socialist caucus, but then the remnants of the ISO, about 4,000 of the 5,000 members remaining of SALT, who are outflanked by the Sanders campaign, and are getting tired with the only thing they can really do is like some worker salting and defend Kasama Sawant's seat. A large portion of Solidarity all liquidate into, and this is funny because these are groups that have hated each other for years, into caucuses. So the ISO generates the ISO and then Solidarity remainders and Workers' Power remainders or whatever. We forgot about Workers' Power and our people still around in 1992. Oh, yeah. But they all liquidate into these caucuses. So the Tempest Collective emerges, Bread and Roses emerges, the International Socialist Project emerges.
Yeah.
The Socialist Alternative section of the DSA emerges. Reform and Revolution emerges. The Independent Socialist Group emerges. A Recomposition, which is no longer around, emerges. Collective Power, which is no longer around, emerges. So one of the reasons why it's hard to talk about the death of American Trotskyism, although I still think it's dying, and we haven't even gotten to the international context, but they just start forming microsects within the DSA as sub tendencies, because they finally remember a lot of these groups have been trying to liquidate into something for forever, and they finally have something to liquidate into.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's right.
We did an episode called "The Death of a Microsect" or something like that, and we said that the microsects have dissolved themselves into the DSA, where they've reconstituted themselves as nanosects because they and then given up their independence.
Yeah, while there are some of these caucuses that are up to about 1,000 people, most of I was actually informed that most of these caucuses membership, and this is not just the post-Trotskyist ones, it's all of them, is around 200 to 400.
Oh yeah.
In a sect of, they say 95K, we probably know it's closer to 70K, but whatever.
It's probably more like 30, to be honest, because like I think that they count you as a member for like 3 full years after you ask them to stop counting you as a member.
Wait,
Because like I think I might still be counted as a member, and if I'm not now, then I was a year ago.
I'm talking about the member in good standing versus the not member in good standing.
Okay, yeah.
And so like, but whatever. Everyone knows that the DSA is still claiming its high point from 2001 as its key number, and everybody who's ever been on an international meeting and goes to a local caucus group is like, there's no way it's actually that high.
Right,
and a lot of people, even without dealing with your situation, Jason, which I call the LDS Church of Socialism, because it's also really hard to not be a Mormon anymore, as far as being officially counted or not. The other issue is a whole lot of people are truly just paper members and do not care, and probably forgot they even have a membership. So it's
well, yeah, because you only pay dues one time,
right? So I guess in this speed run through the broad history of what Trotskyism is in America, like we defined it, that took us 45 minutes, and then skipping the problematic 70s that we're going to come back to, that's going to hurt. Running through basically our lifetimes with Trotskyist and post-Trotskyist organizations, we see pretty clearly the absolute disillusion of Trotskyism into an organization itself, nominally a post-Trotskyist organization, not nominally. They don't recognize their post-Trotskyist organization, but they are. Harringtonism is a subset of late Shachtmanism. Sorry. But not only that organization itself is rapidly declining back into positions historically held by the Trotskyist parties and the Maoist parties in relationship to the Democratic Party itself. But the problem is, so the Trotskyism really no longer in any way, form, or fashion offers a critique on alternative identity to the broad tendency of the reformist left. It does not. Tempest and Bread and Roses. I really mean the Bread and Roses caucus, and I'm not mean to Tempest, and I probably should be. But yes, they write good polemics, but ultimately that is irrelevant.
Yeah, it's entirely irrelevant.
Is Tempest the one that's all former ISO people?
It's former ISO and Solidarity, but so is Bread and Roses is former ISO and Solidarity. So like, the funny thing is now too is like if Solidarity and the ISO are back together, and also they're in league with Cliff Fights. Ironically, in DEF, all of these organizations have finally got over their theoretical defensist positions, which haven't been relevant since 1992 anyway. But as you have pointed out on your show with the apocryphal Mandel calling Cliff, and they both Cliff hangs up on him. They couldn't, even when it was no longer relevant, these people couldn't drop these positions because they've invested like decades and decades of identity. It was
their whole lives,
yeah. So I think that's interesting. Now, as the final question for this, and then we have to go on, we're going to have to recontextualize this in terms of actual fighting grounds because we jumped from the beginning to the end, basically.
We're doing it the way that you read a book for grad school.
Yeah, and then go back and fill in the middle as the paper's relevant. But this isn't just a U.S. trend. One of the things I'm discovering, like researching for this, is Trotskyism and Maoism as separate entities are declining everywhere. Not just here. Like the Trotskyist and Maoist organizations in France, the Trotskyist and Maoist organizations in, well, they're not really Trotskyist. Maoist organizations in Greece, for example, pretty much all died with Syriza. With like some very rump things surviving kind of separately, but not a lot. Trotskyism's fate in Britain, and in addition to the SWP's problems, is so thoroughly tied into Corbynism and labor that they're not relevant anymore in any of the forums, but including stuff like Momentum and stuff like that.
Yep.
And we've seen the increase, strangely, as if from a zombie from a grave, of like dormant official communist parties that have not had any popular appeal for over 40 years, kind of shambling back up, but they still don't have mass bases in any way. I mean, I guess Italy, they might kind of, but also getting in the coalitions that make them irrelevant again. So I think as we go in deeper to this Trotsky problem, I think we're also going to be mapping broader trends on the Marxist left, post 1992 and post 1970s. So that's where we're going to end this at about 2 hours. We obviously,
that's the introduction. Yeah,
we obviously are just going to think this is like the very vaguest of introductions because, like I said, we skipped the New Left and the post-New Left Trotskyist movement because, oh my God, if you think this is confusing, like on my chart, the 70s, like you just see this exponential growth of factions.
Put that chart in the show notes and send it to me so I can put it in ours.
Okay. I will, because that chart, it does help, but it's going to be interesting. Oh my God, there's there's a number of Spartacist splits that I didn't even know about. Anyway,
hell yeah, one episode per Spartacist split. That's what we're gonna do.
There's literally like a block on. It has been alleged that there are at least 4 splits from the Communist Workers Group, split from the International Bolshevik Tendency U.S. section. Anyway,
at a certain point, you just have to
you can't even count them anymore. Like, it's like they might be 2 people, but anyway. So that is the introduction to the decline of Trotskyism in the broadest sense. Let's we'll regroup and focus on a thing about how it happens. Maybe next time, let's focus on why Trotskyist movements went from splitting to entryism.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's actually
a good question.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, the legacy of entryism actually by itself is an excellent topic.
We can start with the history of entryism and then work our way forward.
All right. And with that note, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.